7 years ago, beneath the full moon's glow on the banks of the Ogun River, a man named Segun Adebayo watched his pregnant wife's body disappear beneath the dark water, her screams swallowed by the current, her hands reaching desperately for a husband who just collected 3 million naira in life insurance with her name on the policy. And as the ripples faded into silence, he turned to his mistress waiting in the shadows and whispered, "It's done. Now we can finally be together." Completely unaware that the river spirits were watching, and that 6 years later, a village herbalist would pull something impossible from those same waters. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Lagos, Abuja, maybe London or New York? We want to know. The Harmattan wind swept through Abeokuta that December evening, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and distant fires. And in a modest compound on the outskirts of the ancient city, Folake Adebayo sat on a wooden stool outside her one-room apartment, her hands resting on her swollen belly, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. At 7 months pregnant, she moved slowly, carefully, but her eyes still sparkled with the same hope that had carried her through 3 years of marriage to Segun, 3 years of struggling to build something beautiful from nothing. She smiled as she felt the baby kick, strong and insistent, a reminder that soon, very soon, their family would be complete. Segun had promised her that once the baby came, everything would change. He'd work harder, save more. Maybe even move them out of this cramped compound into something better, somewhere their child could have a room of their own, a yard to play in, a future brighter than the hand-me-down poverty they'd both inherited from their parents. Folake believed him because she loved him, because 4 years ago at a friend's wedding in Ibadan, she'd looked across the dance floor and seen a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, a man who'd asked her to dance and then never stopped talking to her for the rest of the night, telling her about his dreams of becoming a successful businessman, of building something that would last, of finding a woman who'd stand beside him through the struggles until they reached the other side. She'd believed every word, and when he'd proposed 6 months later with a simple silver ring he'd saved for months to buy, she'd said yes without hesitation, ignoring her mother's warnings that Segun came from a family with nothing, that he had no real prospects, that love without money was just suffering with company. But Folake had never cared about money. She'd grown up with 6 siblings in a 2-room house in Mushin, wearing second-hand clothes and eating once a day when times were hard. And she'd learned early that wealth wasn't measured in naira notes, but in the warmth of a home, the strength of a family, the loyalty of a partner who'd hold your hand through the storms. Segun had seemed like that partner, attentive and affectionate in the early days, bringing her small gifts he couldn't afford, plantains from the market, a headscarf in her favorite color, love letters written on torn notebook paper that made her cry with their sincerity. They'd married in a small ceremony with borrowed chairs and homemade jollof rice, dancing under a rented canopy while their families clapped and sang, and Folake had never felt richer, never felt more certain that she'd made the right choice. But then, slowly, imperceptibly at first, things began to change. Segun started coming home late, smelling of beer and cigarettes, his eyes distant and cold when she asked him about his day, about his job at the construction company, about the money that never seemed to stretch far enough to cover rent and food and the small luxuries that other couples took for granted. He'd snap at her over small things, burnt beans, a wrinkled shirt, the sound of her voice when he wanted silence, and then he'd apologize hours later, pulling her close and blaming his temper on stress, on the pressure of being a man who couldn't provide the way he wanted to, on the shame of living in a compound where everyone could hear their arguments through the thin walls. Folake forgave him every time because she remembered the man he'd been, the man she believed was still buried somewhere beneath the frustration and disappointment. And when she discovered she was pregnant 5 months ago, she'd hoped, prayed, that the news would bring back that man, that the promise of fatherhood would reignite the dreams they'd once shared. For a few weeks, it seemed to work. Segan had been gentler, more present, talking about baby names and painting the walls of their tiny room in cheerful yellow. And Folak had allowed herself to believe that they'd turned a corner, that the worst was behind them. But then came the life insurance. 3 weeks ago, Segun had come home excited, more animated than she'd seen him in months, explaining that his company was offering free life insurance policies to all employees. All he needed was for her to sign as the beneficiary. 3 million naira if anything happened to him, enough to take care of her and the baby if something went wrong. Folak had signed without reading the fine print, trusting her husband, grateful for his foresight, never noticing that the policy wasn't on his life at all. It was on hers, with Segun listed as the sole beneficiary, a detail that would only become clear much later, when it was almost too late. Last week, Segun had suggested a trip to the Ogun River, a romantic evening walk along the banks where they'd once gone during their courtship, where he'd first told her he loved her beneath the stars. And Folak had been thrilled, seeing it as another sign that her husband was returning to her, that the distance between them was finally closing. She'd dressed carefully that Friday evening in her best maternity dress, a flowing green ankara that her sister had sewn for her, tying her headscarf in an elaborate jeel that took 20 minutes to perfect, applying the small amount of makeup she owned with trembling fingers because it had been so long since Segun had looked at her with anything resembling desire, and she wanted to remind him of the woman he'd fallen in love with, the woman who was still here beneath the exhaustion and the pregnancy weight and the worry lines that had appeared on her forehead. They'd taken a Danfo bus to the river, Segun unusually quiet beside her, his hand resting on her knee but his eyes staring out the window at the passing streets. And when she'd tried to make conversation, asking him about work, about his day, about the baby's nursery, he'd given short, distracted answers that made her heart sink with familiar disappointment. The river was beautiful in the dying light, the water dark and mysterious, flowing steadily toward the sea, and the banks were mostly empty except for a few fishermen packing up their nets and a woman washing clothes in the shallows downstream. And Folak had walked carefully along the muddy path, one hand on her belly, the other held loosely by Segun, who seemed to be leading her somewhere specific, away from the other people, toward a more isolated stretch where the trees grew thick and the sounds of the city faded into the chirping of crickets and the rush of water. "This is nice," Folak had said, trying to fill the silence. "Being here with you, just the two of us, it reminds me of before, of when we were happy." Segun had stopped walking then, turning to face her, and in the fading light she'd seen something in his eyes that made her breath catch, something cold and final and frightening. "Segun, what's wrong?" she'd asked, her voice small, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. He hadn't answered, hadn't needed to, because suddenly there was movement behind her. Footsteps she hadn't heard approaching, and when Folak turned, she saw a woman emerging from the trees. Tall and beautiful, with expensive clothes and a face Folak recognized from somewhere. From the construction company maybe, from one of Segun's work events. And the way this woman looked at Segun, possessive and triumphant and cruel, told Folak everything she needed to know. "Who is this?" Folak had whispered, though she already knew, had probably known for months without admitting it to herself. "This is Bimpe," Segun had said, his voice flat, emotionless. "And she's the woman I should have married, the woman I love, the woman who's going to help me build the life I deserve." Folak had stumbled backward, her mind refusing to process his words, refusing to accept that this was happening, that her husband, the father of her unborn child, was standing here with another woman, looking at her like she was an obstacle to be removed. "Segun, please, I'm carrying your baby. We're a family. Whatever I did wrong, we can fix it. I'll be better. "You didn't do anything wrong," he'd interrupted. And somehow that was worse, the casual cruelty of it. The implication that this wasn't about her failures, but simply about her existence. You're just not enough, you never were. I settled for you because I was poor and desperate and you were convenient, but Bimpy, she's from a family with connections, with money, with everything I need to become someone important. So you're leaving me? Folak had asked, tears streaming down her face, her legs trembling so badly she thought she might collapse. Not exactly. Bimpy had spoken for the first time, her voice smooth and educated, the voice of someone who'd never known hunger or hardship. You see, Folake, your husband took out a rather substantial life insurance policy on you 3 weeks ago. And given your condition, given how dangerous pregnancy can be, especially for women without access to good medical care, well, accidents happen. The words had taken a moment to penetrate, and when they did, when Folake understood what they were saying, what they were planning, her entire body went cold despite the humid evening air. No, she'd breathed, backing away from them, her hands wrapped protectively around her belly. No, Segun, you can't. I'm your wife. This is your child. You can't. 3 million naira, Segun had said, moving toward her, his face a mask she didn't recognize. That's what your life is worth, Folake. 3 million naira that will set me up with Bimpy. That will get me out of that miserable compound and into the life I was meant to have. Folake had run then, or tried to, but 7 months pregnant, on a muddy riverbank in the dark, she'd been too slow, too heavy, too trusting of the ground beneath her feet, and Segun had caught her easily. His hands, the same hands that had once caressed her face with tenderness, now gripping her arms with brutal force. I'm sorry, he'd whispered, and she'd almost believed him, almost seen a flicker of the man she'd loved in his eyes. But then he'd added, I'm sorry you were never enough. And he'd pushed her, hard, toward the edge where the bank dropped sharply into the deep, fast-moving water. Folake's scream had torn through the night, raw and desperate, as her body hit the cold water, the shock of it stealing her breath. The weight of her pregnancy pulling her down into the darkness, and she tried to swim, tried to fight her way back to the surface, but the current was too strong, dragging her downstream, away from the bank, away from her husband's face watching her drown with Bimpy beside him, away from everything she'd ever known or loved. The water had filled her mouth, her nose, her lungs, burning and choking. And somewhere in the drowning panic, Folek had felt the baby kick one last time, hard and insistent, fighting for life even as the river claimed them both. And her last conscious thought before the darkness swallowed her completely was a prayer, not for herself, but for her child. Please, God, save my baby. Please let something survive this betrayal. The Ogun River had carried her body downstream for miles, tumbling over rocks, scraping against logs, pushing her deeper into its mysterious depths where the spirits were said to dwell, where the old gods still watched over their children. And by the time the current finally released her, depositing her on a muddy bank far from the city, far from witnesses, far from the world that thought she was dead, Folak had been unconscious for so long that her lips were blue and her heartbeat was barely detectable. But the river spirits had been watching, as they always did, and they'd guided her body to a specific place, to a stretch of bank where an old herbalist named Baba Adekunle lived alone in a small hut. A man who'd served the spirits for 50 years, who knew the ways of the water and the secrets of life and death. And when he'd found her in the early morning mist, her pregnant belly still round, her fingers still twitching with the last remnants of life, he'd known immediately that this was no ordinary drowning. Baba Adekunle had worked quickly, pulling her from the mud, performing rituals that had been passed down through generations, calling on the river goddess Oshun to breathe life back into this broken woman. And slowly, impossibly, Folak had coughed up water, her eyes fluttering open to see an ancient face hovering above her, wrinkled and wise and kind. "The baby," she gasped, her hands going to her belly. "Please, save my baby." Baba Adekunle had placed his weathered hands on her stomach, feeling for the movement within, and after a long moment that felt like eternity, he'd smiled. "The child lives. The river has protected you both, but you are badly hurt, and the birth will come soon, too soon." For 3 days, Folake had drifted in and out of consciousness in Baba Adekunle's hut, her body fighting infections from the contaminated river water, her mind replaying the betrayal over and over, seeing Segun's face, hearing his words. "You were never enough." And each time she woke, she'd found the old herbalist beside her, applying poultices made from forest herbs, brewing teas that tasted of earth and healing, speaking prayers in Yoruba that seemed to call on forces beyond human understanding. On the 4th day, the baby had come. Too early, too small, but alive, fighting for breath just as his mother had fought in the water, and Baba Adekunle had delivered him with skilled hands, cutting the cord with a blessed knife, washing him in water mixed with special leaves, and when he'd placed the tiny crying infant on Folake's chest, she'd wept with a mixture of grief and gratitude that threatened to split her heart in two. "My son," she'd whispered, looking down at the perfect, fragile life she'd created. "My beautiful son, your father tried to kill us both, but we survived. We survived." Baba Adekunle had named the child Ayomide, meaning, "My joy has arrived." And over the following weeks, as Folak slowly regained her strength, the herbalist had explained to her what he believed had happened. "The river brought you here for a reason," he'd said, crushing herbs with a mortar and pestle. "The spirit saved you because your story is not finished, because there is justice that must be served. But you are weak, and the world thinks you are dead, and if you return now, your husband will simply try again. And this time he will succeed." "Then what do I do?" Folake had asked, cradling Ayomide against her chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the proof that love could survive even the deepest betrayal. "You wait," Baba Adekunle had said. "You heal, you grow strong, you learn the ways of survival and patience, and when the time is right, when 6 full years have passed and the spirits give me a sign, then you will return, not as the weak woman who was pushed into the river, but as something else, something your husband will not recognize until it is too late." And so Folak had stayed, hidden in the herbalist's compound deep in the forest outside a small village called Itoku, living a simple life of healing and motherhood, watching Ayomide grow from a fragile premature infant into a strong, curious child with his father's eyes and his mother's gentle spirit. 6 years passed like water flowing over stones, slowly reshaping everything it touched, and during those years, Folake transformed herself in ways she'd never imagined possible, learning from Baba Adekunle the arts of herbalism and traditional medicine, studying the properties of plants and roots, understanding how to heal bodies and how to identify poisons, knowledge that felt both sacred and dangerous in her hands. She'd let her hair grow long and wild, dreadlocking naturally in the humid forest air, and her body had become lean and muscular from daily work, carrying water from the stream, tending gardens, grinding herbs, until she barely recognized herself in the reflection of the river that had nearly killed her. Baba Adekunle had taught her more than medicine. He'd taught her patience, strategy, the importance of timing, and most crucially, he'd taught her that justice wasn't always immediate, that sometimes revenge required waiting for the perfect moment when the guilty had grown comfortable in their sins, when they'd forgotten to look over their shoulders, when they believed they'd gotten away with murder. During these 6 years, Folake had occasionally sent Ayomide with trusted villagers to the nearby market, instructing them to listen for news from Abeokuta, and gradually, piece by piece, she'd learned what had become of Segun and Bimpe in her absence. They'd married within 3 months of her death, a lavish ceremony that had scandalized some but impressed many, with Bimpe's family money funding a celebration that included a live band, imported champagne, and matching a suibi for 200 guests, and Segun had used the insurance money to start a construction business that had, with Bimpe's family connections, grown surprisingly successful. They'd moved into a 3-bedroom house in a gated estate in Abeokuta, drove matching cars, attended society parties, and presented themselves as a power couple, young, ambitious, and going places. And everyone who'd known Falak, who'd attended her modest wedding, who'd seen her struggle in that one-room compound, had seemingly forgotten her, erased her from the story of Segun's rise as if she'd never existed. Except for one person, Folaka's younger sister, Kehinde, who'd never believed the official story of an accidental drowning, who'd questioned why Folak would go swimming alone at night while 7 months pregnant, who'd noticed how quickly Segun had moved on, how little grief he'd displayed at the small memorial service where there'd been no body to bury, and Kehinde had spent 6 years asking questions that no one wanted to answer, pestering the police who'd closed the case, visiting the riverbank where her sister had supposedly drowned, refusing to let Folak's memory disappear into convenient silence. It was Kehinde who would become the key to Folak's return, though neither of them knew it yet, and on the morning of the 6th anniversary of Folak's drowning, Kehinde had driven to the Ogun River one more time, standing on the bank where she believed her sister had died, crying silent tears and speaking to the water as if Folake could somehow hear her. "I know he killed you," Kehinde had whispered. "I know it, but I can't prove it. And everyone thinks I'm crazy, obsessed, unable to let go and move on. But I won't stop, Folake. I swear I won't stop until I find the truth." And at that exact moment, in Baba Adekunle's compound many miles downstream, the old herbalist had woken from a dream, his eyes wide and urgent, turning to Folak, who was braiding Iomide's hair outside the hut. "It's time," he'd said, his voice carrying a weight that made Folak's hands still. "The spirits have shown me. Your sister is at the river today, calling for you, and the moment has come for you to return." Folak's heart had begun racing. 6 years of preparation suddenly feeling inadequate. 6 years of imagined confrontations with Segun now becoming terrifyingly real. "I'm not ready. What if he tries again? What if—" "You are ready," Baba Adekunle had interrupted firmly. "You are no longer the trusting girl who signed papers without reading them, who believed in love without questioning, who walked into darkness because her husband asked her to. You have become something else, someone who knows how to survive, how to fight, how to expose evil without becoming evil yourself." Iomide had looked up at his mother with confused eyes. "Mama, where are you going?" "I'm going to find someone." Folake had knelt before her son, her hands cupping his small face. "Someone who needs to know that we're alive, that we're strong, that the people who tried to hurt us didn't win." "My father?" Iomide had asked, because Folake had told him parts of the truth, appropriate pieces for a 6-year-old to understand, about a father who'd made terrible choices, who'd valued money over family, who'd proven that not all parents deserve their children's love. Yes, and others who need to face justice for what they did. Folak had kissed her son's forehead. "Stay with Baba Adekunle. Be good, and know that everything I do now, I do for you. So you grow up in a world where betrayal has consequences, where evil doesn't win simply because it's bold." 3 hours later, Folake had stood at the edge of the Ogun River, the same spot where she'd drowned 6 years ago, and she'd seen a woman kneeling on the bank, crying. And even though Kehinde had grown older, her face marked by grief and frustration, Folake had recognized her sister immediately. "Kehinde?" she'd called out softly, and her sister had frozen, her body going rigid, her crying stopping mid-sob. Kahinda had turned slowly, her face pale with disbelief, her mouth opening and closing without sound, and when she'd finally found her voice, it had come out as a broken whisper. Folake? Is it really you, or am I finally going mad? Folake had stepped closer, letting the sunlight illuminate her face. Her changed appearance, her dreadlocks and lean body, and the quiet strength that radiated from her like heat from a flame. It's really me, sister, I survived, and now I've come back to finish what Segun started. Kahinda had collapsed onto the riverbank, her legs giving out, and Folake had rushed to her side, holding her sister while she sobbed. 6 years of grief and anger and vindication pouring out in great heaving cries that echoed across the water. He pushed you, didn't he? Kahinda had finally asked, pulling back to look into Folake's eyes. I always knew, I told the police. But no one believed me. They said I was just grieving, unable to accept an accident, but I knew. He pushed me, Folake had confirmed. He and his mistress Bimpi, they planned it for the insurance money, 3 million naira in exchange for my life and our baby's life. But the river spirit saved us. An herbalist found me downstream, and I've spent 6 years waiting for this moment. Kahinda's expression had transformed from shock to fierce determination. Tell me what you need. Tell me how to help you destroy them. Over the next 2 weeks, the sisters had planned carefully, using Kahinda's knowledge of Segun's current life and Folake's understanding of timing and psychology, and they'd discovered something crucial. Segun's business was failing. Despite appearances of success, he'd been borrowing heavily from Bimpe's family, making risky deals that had collapsed, and he was on the verge of bankruptcy, desperately trying to maintain the facade of prosperity while the walls closed in around him. He's looking for another big score, Kahinda had explained, showing Folake documents she'd obtained through a friend who worked at the bank. Another insurance policy, another shortcut, and he's been arguing with Bimpe constantly because she's realized he married her for money, not love, and her family is starting to ask questions about where their investments went. Perfect, Folake had said, a plan forming in her mind. Desperation makes people careless, and Segun always did take shortcuts when the pressure was on. They'd arranged for Folake to accidentally encounter Segun at a business meeting, with Kehinde introducing her as a successful herbalist and traditional medicine consultant who was advising wealthy clients on health and wellness, a persona that was both true and strategic. And when Segun had first seen Folake, he'd looked right past her, seeing a confident woman with dreadlocks and expensive jewelry, not recognizing the wife he'd murdered 6 years ago. This is Iya Ayomide, Kehinde had said, using Folake's new name. She's been working with some very prominent families, and I thought she might be able to help with your wife's health issues. Segun's eyes had narrowed with interest because Bimpi had been suffering from mysterious ailments lately, stress-related problems that no doctor had been able to resolve, and he'd agreed to a consultation, still not recognizing the woman standing before him. Folake had visited their home, the house built with her insurance money, and she'd seen Bimpe, older now, harder, her beauty corroded by bitterness and the realization that marrying for money had brought neither happiness nor security. And when Bimpe had complained about her symptoms, about her failing marriage, about feeling like she was being punished for something, Folake had smiled internally and prescribed herbs that would do no harm, but would give her time to execute her plan. Over the following weeks, Folake had become a trusted advisor to both Segun and Bimpe, listening to their problems, offering wisdom that seemed profound, but was really just common sense wrapped in traditional mysticism. And slowly, carefully, she'd planted seeds of suspicion between them, suggesting to Bimpi that Segun might be planning something desperate, hinting to Segun that Bimpi's family was about to demand repayment of their loans, watching as the couple's marriage deteriorated under the weight of guilt and paranoia they'd been carrying for 6 years. The breakthrough had come when Segun, desperate and foolish, had confided in Iya Ayomide that he was considering taking out another insurance policy, this time on Bimpe, that he needed a way out of his financial problems. And would she know any herbalists who could provide something? something that would look like natural causes, something untraceable. Folak had looked at her husband, the man who'd pushed her pregnant body into a river, now asking her to help him murder his second wife, and she'd felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "I know exactly what you need," she'd said, and she'd arranged a meeting at the Ogun River, in the exact spot where he'd tried to kill her, telling him she'd bring the poison, telling him to come alone, and Segun, blinded by desperation and arrogance, had agreed. On the night of the meeting, Folake had arrived early, accompanied by Kehinde, by Baba Adekunle who'd insisted on being present, and by a police detective named Inspector Okafor, whom Kehinde had finally convinced to investigate after presenting him with recorded conversations between Segun and Iya Ayomide discussing murder. When Segun had arrived, confident and eager, ready to collect his poison and kill his second wife just as he'd killed his first, Folake had stepped forward into the moonlight, removing the headscarf that had partially obscured her face, letting him see her clearly for the first time. "Hello, Segun," she'd said quietly. "Remember me." The recognition had hit him like a physical blow, his face draining of color, his legs buckling, and he'd stumbled backward toward the river's edge. "No, no, you're dead. I watched you drown. This isn't possible." "The river didn't want me," Folake had said, moving closer. "The spirit saved me, kept me alive so I could come back and show the world who you really are. A murderer, a thief, a man who valued money over the life of his wife and unborn child." "I have your confession recorded." Inspector Okafor had stepped forward. "Planning to murder your current wife, admitting to financial fraud, and based on new evidence and testimony, we're reopening the investigation into Folake Adebayo's death 6 years ago." Segun had been arrested that night, and within weeks, the full story had emerged. The insurance fraud, Bimpe's involvement, the conspiracy to commit murder, and both Segun and Bimpe had been sentenced to 20 years in prison. Their assets seized, their reputations destroyed, and Folake had stood in the courtroom, holding Iomide's hand, watching justice finally prevail. 6 months later, Folake had opened a shelter for women escaping domestic violence, funded partially by the restitution she'd won from Segun's seized assets, and she'd become a voice for survivors, teaching them that betrayal doesn't define you, but how you rise from it does. That sometimes you have to drown before you learn to breathe underwater. That the river that tries to kill you can also teach you to swim. And on quiet evenings, she'd take Iomide to the Ogun River, and they'd sit on the bank watching the water flow. And she'd tell him that this place where darkness had tried to claim them had instead become the birthplace of their strength, proving that what doesn't kill you doesn't just make you stronger, it transforms you into exactly what your enemies should have feared all along. Which moment hit you the hardest? Drop a comment below with your thoughts and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love hearing from our viewers around the world. Your support keeps these stories coming. Thank you for watching, and remember, betrayal doesn't define you, how you rise from it does. See you in the next one.